We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's May 2022 and we're off the coast of Albany, Western Australia. Lisa Blair set sail from here 92 days ago with a dream of becoming the fastest person to sail solo, non-stop and unassisted around Antarctica. The last 92 days haven't been easy. She's battled blizzards, snowstorms and waves as high as 5-story buildings. But they're nothing compared to her first attempt in 2017, where she nearly didn't live to tell the tale. Resilience, drive and passion have propelled her to come back and give it another go. It's all about to become worth it. I'm at Middleton and this is Head Game. Today, Lisa Blair on facing fear and smashing world records. Now, Lisa, the first time we met was on $1 Million Island. Do you remember that?
Yeah, very, very vividly. I was super excited to meet you at the time because you've always been, a huge inspiration for me just as an adventurer. And it was super fun to work with you on the show.
Do you know what? Talking about adventurer, I didn't realise how much of an adventurer you were. But you are someone who just absolutely thrives on adventure. Sailing is a bespoke, I would say, sport. When did you first get into it, and when did you first think, right, it'd be great to tackle all of these phenomenal feats?
Yeah, look, aside from all the mindset side of sailing, you're also the plumber, the engineer, the sailmaker, the navigator, the rigger, the cook, the cleaner. You've really got to carry kind of all of those hats. And I first got on a boat, I'd been on boats a little bit as a kid. My mum's quite into sailing. But it wasn't until I got a job as the cook and the cleaner on a charter boat in the Whitsunday Islands. And I was literally scrubbing the toilets and then cooking the meals, not quite in that order, but provisioning the boat and everything. And I would watch the skipper and I would watch him wear all those hats and do all those roles and, park the boat, man the crew, and just dominate in that field. And I just thought to myself, this is such a cool sport because it's not just one kind of area of knowledge. You don't just peak in one zone. You don't just learn the wind. You've got to learn how to repair everything and run the whole boat and navigate and all of that as well. And I just wanted to chase that and see how far I could go.
When's the first time that you actually set sail by yourself? Can you remember that, when you jumped on a boat by yourself and you thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a crack?
Yeah, everyone thought I was nuts. I had finished a crude race around the world. So I'd done 40,000 nautical miles of ocean sailing by this point with a crew of 16 people and just thrived and loved it. And I sort of looked at all of these crude scenarios and thought, well, how do you step it up from here? How do you make it tougher? And after circumnavigating, I was like, well, there's nothing harder than doing it on your own. And so I signed up to do this yacht race called the Trans-Tasman Yacht Race. And I was the only girl to sign up and I was the only person that didn't own a boat. And the organisers just laughed at me when I was trying to ask them, how long do I have to tell you that I have a boat for this project? And I managed to secure a boat ultra last minute, 8 days or so before I had to set sail from Australia. I didn't even get a chance to put the sails up on this boat before I left. I had 12 days to get it to New Zealand, and I figured, well, I've got 12 days in the middle of the ocean. Surely I can figure it out. I'll just go and have a crack. And literally everything that could possibly go wrong on that trip went wrong. It's, kind of expected when you're going to have your first ocean crossing, but most people's first sort of solo trips, maybe a day sail across the harbour or something. I was sailing from Australia to New Zealand as my very first sort of solo trip. And I left port, and about 3 hours after leaving port, and I had all these kind of teething problems with the boat, I put the autopilot on and then the alarms started tripping and the autopilot did pirouettes and just sent the boat in circles. And so then I was having a glitch with the autopilot. I couldn't sleep, so I was doing these 20-minute micro sleeps. And because the autopilot wasn't reliable, I was kipping right by the wheel, hugging the helm of the boat so that every 20 minutes I could wake up. And then if the autopilot wigged out, I could do this little donut and correct the boat and keep it sailing. It was definitely much like reaching for a goal that was like way over my head, no idea how to get there, but just thinking if I just go for it, I should be able to make it there eventually, and just taking that leap. And so the boat wasn't right. The trip was a huge, enormous trip for the first trip. But you know what? I did it. I got there and back, and I sailed 3,000 nautical miles across the Tasman Sea solo. And that's what then kickstarted the next project.
And what ignited that mindset for you to go, right, I'm just going to go and do this. I haven't got a boat. I'm just going to find a boat. Was there any doubt at all when you first took this on, or were you just super excited about
I think I was shaking like a leaf when I set off. And then I unfurled the first sail, and I realised I hadn't actually unfurled it yet before to even just check. And I had a big hole through the middle of it. So my first couple of hours was hand stitching this sail back together. And I was just like, what am I getting myself into? But originally my mindset fully shifted from the kind of like I can't to if I just start, I'll find a way kind of attitude. It was a TV ad that changed my mind. And it's wild to talk about it like that and be like, oh yeah, no, a TV ad changed my mindset. And it was a combination of a whole bunch of other factors as well. But I was on the fence of this yacht race, the Clipper race that I just mentioned before, that crude yacht race around the world. And it's an amateur yacht race. So you pay a berth fee, you sign up, and you race each other around the planet. And you spend 12 months ocean racing with a crew you don't know, with a skipper you don't know, on identical boats. And I just thought that looked like adventure. But to pay the $80,000 berth fee, I was earning $20 an hour cash, like at this tiny little supermarket job, working paycheck to paycheck, zero savings, no idea how I'd do that. I was 25 years old just thinking, I want more adventure, but I had no idea how to do it. And the mindset shift came when the punchline of this ad, and I honestly couldn't tell you what it was advertising, but the punchline was, just do because the world is changed by doers. And until then, I'd always been a dreamer. I'd always been like, oh, that'd be great to do one day. I'd love to have that adventure one day. But I wasn't actioning any of those. And here was a real live adventure directly in front of me that I could action. And that was 2 years before I did this solo race. So 2 years earlier, I had never sailed around the world. I'd never done an ocean crossing. I had never done any of that. And here I was, a circumnavigator, 40,000 nautical miles of ocean sailing experience. And that idea of like, well, what else could I do? If I've done this and this wasn't possible to me 2 years earlier, what else could I achieve? And so when I started the solo sailing, I really was like, well, I don't know if I like solo sailing or not yet. So let's have a crack.
Find out.
Yeah, go and find out. Obviously, I loved it. But also I wanted to put myself in a situation where I could only become stronger. And I could see solo sailing giving me that perfect storm environment that would allow me to do that if I took the right attitude into it. And that attitude was very much around, there's always a solution to every problem. You've got to think outside the box. You've got to trust yourself, trust your decision, and back yourself to do it. And yeah, there are terrifying moments, but like if you don't live, then what's life for? Like I'm out there living, having incredible adventures, having these moments and experiences that I wouldn't otherwise get if I didn't push myself to those limits. And I could die in a car accident tomorrow. So, that to me really stopped me being super worried about leaving and more focused on, okay, well, how can I make this trip as safe as possible from here?
Yeah, what strikes me here is that you're super present in the moment, because being able to sort of get a calling from an advert, looking at that or listening to that and thinking, that's talking to me. You have to be present in the moment there. You have to be connected with yourself. How do you all of a sudden go, do you know what? I'm going to sail unassisted around Antarctica.
Yeah, it was really... It's funny because initially when someone suggested the Antarctica record to me, it was while I was trying to convince him to lend me his boat to do that New Zealand trip on. And it was this complete stranger, and I had phoned him up and said, hi, my name's Lisa. I've done blah, blah, blah. I want to do this New Zealand race. Will you lend me your boat? And he was like, look, I'm not going to lend you the boat, but maybe if you could combine this project with something larger, you might be able to buy the boat. And I was like, okay, cool. And he threw out this name, Fedor Konyakov, about this Russian sailor. And I went, back to my house and I Googled this guy, and he's summited Mount Everest. He's sailed around the world solo 4 times. He's done dog sled teams to the North Pole, South Pole. He's rode across from Chile to Australia, from New Zealand to Cape Horn. He's hot air ballooned around the world. Like, he's just done the most remarkable, endless adventures. And one of his trips was sailing solo around Antarctica. And so this guy's like, look, my boat's perfect for it. Have a look at it, see what you think. And I looked at that, and I'd done enough sailing in the Southern Ocean to realize, you know, the size of that challenge. And I just looked at it and thought, there's no way someone who's been sailing for 3 years would be capable of doing this record. And I canned it. I said, no, not a chance. Like, I'm not suicidal. This is a no for me. Or at least, like, this is a no for now. I need more experience. But then I was working in the tropics again, and it's like sunshine, you got coral reefs around, you got tourists, you're like doing all that fun sort of, too easy, right? And I couldn't shake that idea that, well, what if? And I started Googling, and I was like, oh, well, you know, where's the closest iceberg's going to be, or how cold's cold going to get, and how frequently are the storms likely to be? What's the worst case scenario for storms and weather management that I might face down there? And after months of research, and then in that period of research, I also did that Trans-Tasman race, I suddenly was like, well, you know what? I think it's possible to do. It's obviously possible because Fedor's done it. So what's stopping me from becoming the person that can do that? And I spoke to Mum about it before I committed, and I was like, had the chat with the family, and I said, so what do you guys think about this idea of, you know, sailing solo around Antarctica? And they initially were hard nose, which is, you know, pretty smart. and then they
not even let's think about it is like.
No, it was a hard no. And then I did the trip to New Zealand, and I asked again, and they were like, oh, well, I suppose you know enough about what you're doing to know whether you feel you're comfortable doing it or not. And then they started backing me, and I started campaigning. And it took me like 3.5 years to get to the start line of that project. And I still, to this day, aside from the dismasting, talk about that as the hardest part of this project was reaching the start line, like hands down. Because that's the time where all your self-doubt, all your idea of what you're capable of, not capable of, all that fear factor kind of comes into play. Because once you've left, you're committed. You're on the boat. You're in the middle of the ocean. You're there. You just got to find a way through. But getting to that point, that was hard. That was, yeah.
So is that why it took 3.5 years? Could it have happened earlier, or was there the sort of a bit of doubt in there?
Yeah, I guess there's always like going to be those doubt moments, right? You're always going to have moments where you go, what am I doing? This is nuts. And, you know, I was about 26, 27 at the time. All my friends are going out socializing. I'm working on my computer trying to write sponsorship proposals. But ultimately it was the chicken and the egg factor. I couldn't get sponsors to believe in me without having a boat, and I couldn't buy the boat without the sponsorship dollars. And so it really, like, every year it came to a crunch point where I wouldn't have enough time to safely prepare the boat. So I'd have to push it back another 12 months, and then I'd hit that crunch time again. And if I didn't have a sponsor, I had to push it back again. And so it became this real challenge to just get to the start line. And ultimately, it was Mum trying to convince me to lend money against the family home to buy the boat that was the tipping point of the campaign. But even with that, I bought the boat in 2016, raced at the Sydney to Hobart. I still didn't have enough money to go on the project 3 months before I left for the project. And I had half the budget. I started ripping the boat to pieces, and I was like, well, I'm just going to have to do it. Like, there's got to be a way. And I left for that project with over $300,000 in outstanding bills, like, and no way of raising that money. But I was like, if I don't go and come back, I'll never find a way to sort that. Like, I've just got to do it. Like, I've just got to. So we mortgaged the house. I borrowed as much personal money as I could. I had investors, and then I had corporate sponsors, donations from the public, just anything I could possibly think of. It was just I was still a nobody, not that I expect I'm a somebody now, but I hadn't done a big project solo yet. I'd done the Trans-Tasman, but in the sailing world, that wasn't large enough to warrant the funding or the backing. And even now, sailing's just not treated the same way from a sponsorship perspective. So it's still always hard to get those sort of supporting funds going forward. But that was the big ticket for me. That was the big challenge, raising the money.
And, just for I say between us, it's not. It's going to be between us and the whole of
Between
Australia.
us and a million of your closest friends.
How much? Yeah, exactly. How much, funding do you need to sail unassisted around the Antarctica?
For a record of that scale, the biggest budget factor of that is the boat, making sure the boat's as built and as safe as possible. So the whole project ended up costing roughly around $700,000, which is a lot of money. And that's spread over a 2-year campaign, really, because you've got all that preparation phase leading into it, plus you've got the record itself and then the aftermath maintenance and upkeep of the boat. But just even my satellite bill for sending a photo back once a week, a photo a day, a 30-second video once a week, and the daily blogs was like $45,000. And that was at the cost price. So, one sail on my boat is like $30,000 just for a sail.
Yeah, that's insane. And that's what I mean, the preparation, the planning, and also for you to have this equipment, knowing that this is your lifeline ultimately.
It's critical. And ultimately, like the amount of stress that the boat itself goes through on a campaign like this, like we're not talking, normal sailing oceans. Like we're talking the worst of the worst conditions you can humanly face. And the boat's expected to survive those conditions for 3 months. So we're talking 10-meter waves. We're talking winds at sort of 80 knots, which is like probably 140 kilometre-hour winds. And that's every week that the boat's going through that. So the wear and tear and the fatigue on the vessel is so extreme that if you don't start with brand new gear, it won't last the distance. And even with new gear, I was basically rebuilding the boat around me as I'm sailing. I would rip fittings out of the deck and I'd be bolting stuff to patch the hole on the side of the boat, and I'd be running these repairs constantly. It became a bigger challenge of the record was the repair and the maintenance element over the actual performance and running of the record, just to keep the boat floating.
Take me back to the day that you set off in 2017 on your first attempt. Just talk me through your headspace. Can you remember your headspace when you were just about to get onto the boat? Talk me through that and tell me what you were thinking and what you were feeling.
Absolute chaos stations, because I was still so behind, like all this, like I was up until like 2 a.m, still loading the boat with supplies, just like lashing things down. And then I had to download like books to read on my Kindle and things like that to have on board the boat with me. And so I was up like super late. I think I managed about 2 hours sleep. And this is on the back of weeks and weeks of late nights and working hard to get the boat started. And it was just such a rush in the morning. We were all rushing. Everyone's rushing. And then suddenly everyone goes, okay, it's time to say goodbye. And I was like, what? It's like go time. And they're like, yeah, it's go time. And I was like, huh. And it's Albany in Western Australia. So there's this pretty large marina with a big car park on the left, and they had the markets on that day. So the car park was full of people for the markets. And they were doing hourly announcements on my departure. And I didn't realize that all of this was happening. So I'm like, throw a line to the boat that's going to tow me out of the marina. And I look up for the first time in probably an hour to like give people a hug goodbye. And we cast the last lines off. And as we start motoring out, suddenly all these people, like hundreds and hundreds of people, their car horns are tooting, they're cheering. People have got their kids have painted signs saying good luck, and they've got them up on the boardwalk and they're running around and screaming good luck. And it was like the most overwhelmed I think I've ever been, because it was off the back of years and years of preparation and planning. But in those years, I'm thinking of every possible worst case scenario. I'm not thinking of the good days. I'm thinking of all the bad days that are ahead. And suddenly I was in this moment where I had to smile and wave and act like, normal to a crowd of people, while internally I was hyperventilating and my heart rate was jacked up and I was shaking and I was like trying really hard to smile, but I was just so overwhelmed by it and thinking like I have to now live through those scenarios. Like these aren't fantasy things that I've come up with. These are likely scenarios to occur in the middle of the ocean on this trip. And I now have to go and face them. And it was, incredibly daunting, but I then reminded myself of all that preparation planning and that the boat is as good as she'll ever get and that it's the right boat for the job and I've got the right support network behind me and that I can do it. And
start thinking about the positives rather than all the negatives and the bad days that are in front of you. You know, you're now committed. And I suppose if you stayed in that headspace of thinking about all the negatives, then your journey would have probably been a negative.
Probably would have been a very short
start,
one.
right? Yeah, exactly. So when was that moment? Do you remember that moment where you sort of took that deep breath and you're like, clear the mind, right? I'm committed now.
Yeah, it was about 10 seconds to the start line. And I had to tack the boat around. I had the start committee vessel there because it's all adjudicated by the World Sailing Speed Record Council. So they have an official adjudicator. And so we had this established start line and I tacked the boat and everyone started cheering and I just took it for the joy that it was and just took that big deep breath and then I was off and then I was just so excited and I, because this was the accumulation of so much work, I was just so happy to be going and so ready to be gone and on that adventure and I just waved like a maniac, ran around the boat and sort of said goodbye to everybody and then we were off and about 3 hours later we lost sight of Australia until we sailed back to Australia months later.
Wow. What was the game plan in your head? How many days did you envision it would take? What was the sort of the general sort of the general picture of what you were about to take on?
Yeah, so because Fedor Konyukov did it he set the record in 102 days and he competed as a racetrack called the Antarctica Cup Ocean Racetrack, which meant that he had these sort of latitude guidelines that once he entered into this formal kind of racetrack, he wasn't allowed to exit it after he entered onto the track or he voided the record. So if I'm challenging his record, I had the same kind of rules as him. So it was an estimated distance of around 14,000 nautical miles to be sailed. 3 months, hopefully, if I'm breaking Fedor's record. And I had to start and finish from Albany in Western Australia because that's where Fedor started from, and then sail directly south until I entered into the gated entry point at 45 degrees south. So if you imagine like the southern tip of Tasmania is roughly 45 south, and then the bottom end of the racetrack is 60 south, which would be like the most northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So that gap between that Southern Ocean section, that open ocean bit, that was my racetrack. So once I entered, I then turned left and just started heading towards Cape Horn or South America.
Wow. And this is your first attempt. You've got that vision in your head. Did you settle into a routine quite quick? Just talk us through a day-to-day in the life of yourself on that boat when things were panning out and when you sort of got into your rhythm.
I took about 2 weeks on that record to really feel like I'd recovered from the stress of land life, just getting to the start line, like all that pushing, working super late, sleeping no sleep. And then the whole trip, when I'm close to land or known hazards, so near shipping lanes, fishing destinations, islands, or any landmass, I'm sleeping 20-minute micro sleeps the whole time. So I'll do a 6 to 8 hour window and every 20 minutes I wake up and scan the horizon 360 and I check my instruments for risks or hazards that might be ahead of me like icebergs, and then I go back for another 20-minute sleep. So I found that I ended up staying on the Australian time zone, and so I would end up by like halfway around the trip, I was like awake all night and sleeping all day rather than like normal daylight hours. And and so then I would wake up at maybe 10 a.m. or something after these 20-minute micro sleeps for most of the night. And I'd scan the horizon. I'd go up on deck and check the sails are good. I'd eat something. And then depending on what the requirements of the boat were. So early on, I had a little bit more free time because they hadn't broken as many things. But as we got further along on the trip, I was breaking things fairly frequently and I would fix it and then break it and then fix it again and then break it again. And so I spent a good portion of my like morning to sort of mid-afternoon fixing or doing repairs on the boat. And then I would be getting a daily weather forecast coming through as well from my meteorologist, Bob McDavitt, on shore. And he would be letting me know if a new like polar cyclone's coming or a big storm or what's kind of like my next 3 or 4 days going to look like. And that would set up the rest of my day because if I've got a storm coming, I had to do pre-storm checks and set the boat up for the storm, which included like getting the storm sails up, bolting the floorboards down, doing things like steering checks, rigging checks, just making sure she's safe to go through those conditions. And if I was just after a storm, then I'd be more maintenance because I had calmer conditions, so I'd get more maintenance in. And then I would try and get another sleep in some stage in the afternoon if I could, just a 2 or 3 hour to fill me through. And there'd normally be a weather change at sunset and a weather change around midnight and a weather change at sunrise. So generally at those times, I'd either have to trim the sails or I'd have to shorten them or increase the sails as the conditions changed. So I'd just be kind of winding down from the last sail change, having a bite to eat for dinner, and then the next sail change would come up. And then by like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., I'd get back into my bunk and get a couple of little sleeps in again. So I think on average I was working on about 2 to 4 hours a day of accumulated sleep most of the trip. But any extra downtime was sleep banking.
And talk me through the nightmare day that you had.
Yeah, it's what I like to call a bad day in the office.
Yeah, the bad day. Take me. That's it. Do you know what? Get straight to it. Take me back to the bad day in the office.
So by this point, I had been on record for 72 days. So I had sailed the whole South Pacific Ocean. I'd been through storms that were generating waves up to 12 meters. I had seen 80 knots of wind. I had rounded what we call the Mount Everest of sailing, which is Cape Horn. So we consider that the most dangerous section of the world to sail around. And so I'd rounded that. I'd passed through an area of ocean called Iceberg Alley, where there's the highest density of icebergs. I'd gone through about 2 weeks of snowstorms, squalls, just really tough, trying conditions. But the whole time, the boat felt good. Like she felt solid. She felt like I had no question mark on whether the boat could take it. We were just going through like kind of the motions. And we'd crossed the South Atlantic and we were just exiting the South Atlantic and about to go into the South Indian Ocean. And I was 1,000 nautical miles directly south of South Africa. So in the middle of nowhere, absolute nowhere. And it wasn't morning. It was 6 p.m. at night, and I happened to have been up for a cat nap, been on deck, done my sunset deck checks. I had a new storm building that night. The sea state was about 6 to 8 meters, so imagine like a 2 to 3 story building as a wave, and that's kind of what you're sailing through. But you're so desensitized to large waves because you've been in that environment for so long.
Yeah, you've just sailed through those, right? You've just sailed through what you thought was the hardest point. And now you're sort of not on the back end of things, but you're like, right.
It was the home stretch. Australia was
you're
4 weeks away.
bulletproof. Your mindset's bulletproof. You think the boat's good to go, and then
you get that 1% of chaos. Yeah. So I was napping in my bunk and I just heard this super loud bang. Like it sounded like I've never actually heard a real gunshot. You'd probably be able to tell me this, but it sounded like a gunshot going off where there was like this metallic kind of after ringing in my eardrum. And I launched out of my bunk and onto my engine box. And I have this little Perspex clear dome on the top of the engine box so I can look out without physically having to kind of climb out of the boat. And I jumped up on there and I initially thought it was something at the back of the boat that had broken. So I looked to the back of the boat. It's just that sort of blue tinge of sunset, where you're just about to lose the last bit of daylight. So you can see enough, but it's not daylight still. And I looked back and everything looked normal. And then I looked to the front of the boat and all I could see was my 22-meter aluminium mast just flexing and bending like a hula girl shaking her hips. And it really was just wobbling around like this crazy movement that a mast should absolutely not have. And I initially thought, tack the boat, change the direction of the boat and put the pressure of the wind on the non-broken side because I realised I'd broken a piece of rigging. And before I even had a chance to do that, the mast came crashing down. And honestly, being so remote a location and understanding how remote I was and knowing that this was one of those worst case scenarios happening, listening to the sounds of the boat as it's that twisting, metal on metal grinding and shaking, and all the forces on the boat have changed, so the whole boat shuddering around you. And I didn't, I kind of knew that it was the mast, but I didn't know what other damage was taking place because the sheer noise, the volume of it was just deafeningly loud. And like if you've ever seen like one of those car yards where they crush the cars and it's got that real high-pitched metal grinding, like nails down the chalkboard kind of sound, it was that like amplified 1,000 times inside the boat. And I ran out on deck, like I had my life jacket on and my safety tether, so I clipped onto the boat and I climbed out and I looked forward, and where my mast used to be was just air. There was just nothing there. And like in a traditional kind of dismasting, and for those listening who don't know what a mast is, it's the sticky bit that goes up on a sailboat that your sails fly on. It's the tall part. And so it had snapped at deck level. Like there was nothing standing out of the boat anymore. And it's highly unlikely that it would normally do that. But what happens now is I've got a 22-meter long spear tangled to the boat with all the other rigging and the ropes and everything in 8-meter breaking seas, about to go into a new storm the size of a hurricane or a cyclone, and I'm alone 1,000 miles from land in crap conditions. And what can happen is one of those waves can drive the mast through the hull of the boat and start sinking you. And at the initial time of the emergency, the bottom sort of 2 meters of the mast was trapped on the deck by all those ropes. But these waves, because I'm technically like now anchored in the middle of a storm, so the boat drifted 180 degrees around because I was anchored on the sails and the debris in the ocean, the volume of debris in the ocean. And the waves, these 6 to 8 meter waves, were smashing into the mast and rigging first and then driving it up onto the deck of the boat and like forcing it forward. And then the white water would hit the hull of the boat and shove the boat out from kind of underneath the mast. And it became so violent that it was basically starting to cut the boat in half. And so it started to saw the boat in half with the force behind this happening.
What is going through your mind, Lisa, when you're seeing this? Because you are now at the mercy of Mother Nature. You can't do anything. What do you do? What's going through your head?
Initially, it was on a loop going, this is so not good, this is so not good, this is so not good, this is so not good. And it was really like the panic stations. Like I had planned for a dismasting, I had planned for an emergency like this, but I hadn't planned for the emotional response of an emergency like that. And I hadn't really considered, like I guess I had tried to puzzle through how I thought I would react, and I'd apply logic and I would save the boat and it would all be wonderful and there's rainbows and like pretty clouds and it's all perfect. But real world doesn't happen that way. And so I panicked. The first sort of 10 to 15 minutes, I just blindly was like, I've got to cut it free. I've got to cut it free before it sinks the boat, before one of those waves rips the mast off and throws it through the hull. And I was extremely conscious of the fact that if I had to abandon my life raft, the sea state was going to build to, 10 meters that night. And this inflatable rubber life raft, it's not going to survive. Like it would be a death sentence to abandon the boat. So my only way of surviving was going to be to keep that boat floating. And so initially it was that panic, and it was not really logically thinking about it, but just thinking, I've got to get the rigging free. I've got to cut it free. I've just got to get into it. And so I grabbed tools and I started trying to use the bolt cutters, but the boat's pitching and rolling and hard swell, and you got these waves are breaking clean across the decks now. So you're not moving with the waves, so you're not softening the blow of the waves anymore. You're a hard object and the waves are hitting you like a battery ram. And when they hit, they throw the boat like 50 meters sideways, and then all the white water like barrels across the top, and you end up like engulfed up to your neck in white water. And so just holding on was hard, let alone trying to jump on bolt cutters to cut like 14 mil wire. And when it became quite clear that that wasn't going to work, I had another system I'd sort of pre-thought of, and it was what I like to call my dismasting kit. And it was this set of tools in a hot pink pencil case that was at the front of a locker, easy to grab in an emergency and easy to find. And it was basically a flathead screwdriver, a set of needle nose pliers, a pair of multi-grips, and a pair of pliers. And the intention was to disconnect the piece of rigging from the boat rather than trying to cut it. And they have these tiny little pieces of metal called a split pin. So my intention was to basically like knock out the split pin, which was this joining pin for the rigging, so that I wasn't cutting the rigging anymore, but I was disconnecting it. And I guess like that's quite different to do when you're on land, because on land it's stable, it's quite a balanced boat. You're normally in a marina or something, it's flat. But in a pitching seaway, that was quite difficult. And so I put my pliers into the fitting and tried to knock out the split pin and it wasn't working. Then I tried the flathead screwdriver. And at this point, I'm still so reactive and I'm still in that panic stations and I'm not really thinking. I'm just thinking, I've got to get it free. I've got to get it free. And I'm so fixated on the fact that it has to get free in like seconds that I'm not really thinking about the right way to get it free necessarily. And I'm shaking so hard that when I'm smashing this fitting, trying to knock it out and like hammer the screwdriver, I'm missing the screwdriver and I'm striking my hand and my whole left hand like starts ballooning up. And after about 15 minutes of just trying and panicking, I think I've got no time. I need more tools. And I just bolt into the boat and I start tearing apart my toolbox and I'm like pulling everything out. Like the whole inside of the boat's now carnage because I've literally ripped everything out, just trying to find a better option. And it wasn't until I started doing that I started getting enough kind of thought process happening and thinking to myself that, you know, maybe I should probably tell somebody that I'm going through this because I hadn't even issued an alarm or anything yet.
Wow. Even though you know that you can't go anywhere, did that trigger in your head that this trip's over, that it's done? Or
I was, yeah, definitely. It was disaster. Like it was 3.5 years of work gone in a second. I just was so in the panic state of reacting and not thinking. And it wasn't until I started like tearing the tools apart that I started thinking again. And it was then that I thought I need to call Jeff, who's my shore manager. And so I called him and I issued a pan and it's 3 a.m. in Australia. So I woke the poor bloke up.
Pan, that's an emergency, right?
Yes. And it's one step below a mayday. So it means I require assistance, but I'm not at immediate risk of loss of life or vessel. Now, I know sounds silly.
But this is a mayday, right?
This is a mayday.
Yeah.
But it would take him 3 days to reach me. So there was no point issuing a mayday because they would be recovering a body or I would have saved myself. That was the choices. And there's no point putting other people at risk to recover a sunk boat or try and go on a big search and rescue for a vessel that's missing, that's sunk. So I knew the realities of all of that in that situation. So I issued the pan more to like put them on high alert that I was in that situation, but not to actually send a rescue to me. If you imagine it like we actually calculated this later on, what the minimum time it would have taken the Rescue Coordination Centre in Cape Town to reach me. And they worked out that they would have to fly a helicopter to its maximum fuel range, land it on a ship, drive the ship for about 2.5 days south, and then fly that helicopter to its maximum rescue range, pick me up off the boat, fly it back to the ship, drive the ship 2.5 days back to the north, and then fly the helicopter to land. And that was going to be their fastest recovery, and it would take 3 days. So I knew that. If I couldn't separate the mast from the boat, I was dead. Simple as that.
What goes on next?
I run back up and I start again at that one piece of rigging at the back of the boat trying to disconnect it. And after about another 15 minutes or so, I finally got it disconnected. And that was the first moment that I really thought I had maybe a shot at surviving tonight somehow. And what was also happening was as these waves were coming through, every time a wave would hit, it would break another rope or tear another piece of the boat off. And so I've still got 5 more pieces of rigging to go to disconnect the rigging, to disconnect the mast. But that was the first piece I was able to separate. And I didn't know if my theory was going to work until then. And so that gave me the hope that I needed to like push through the rest. And at the same time, this is Antarctica. So I'm going into hypothermia. I'm soaked through in freezing temperatures. And I managed to crawl to the bow of the boat and I disconnected the inner forestay rigging wire. And then the next piece I needed to disconnect was the forestay wire. And this is the one at the very, very front of the boat that normally the jib or the front sails fly off. And as I looked at it, I was like kind of huddled against the safety rails on the left-hand side of the boat. All the safety rails on the right-hand side had been ripped off when the mast came down. So there was no rails left there, but the waves were coming from that direction. So they would kind of hit you and then drag you down the left-hand side of the boat. And then I'd scramble back up to my position and try and assess this piece of rigging I needed to disconnect. And as I looked at it, I realized that the piece I needed to knock out was trapped under what we call a furling drum, which is like just a sort of drum piece of equipment at the bottom of the mast. And the way it was trapped meant that I had possibly two options that I could come up with. And option one was to like wedge my left arm like under the drum, put my screwdriver in the fitting and wrap my other arm like all the way around it and like hug the fitting and like knock it out that way. But when I disconnected the inner forestay, it had like been pushed around by the force of those waves so violently that it was like this huge whipping snake on the deck of the boat doing absolute carnage, like tearing bits of the boat up, and just it would have crushed my arm, broken ribs, or otherwise stopped me from being able to save the boat and done severe injury. And the only other thing I could think of in that moment in time, with the tools and the equipment available to me, was to physically climb outside the safety rails on the bow of the boat and sit down on the bowsprit, which is that sort of black stick that you can often see on the front of racing yachts. And out there, I am completely exposed to these waves coming through. So these waves are throwing a 10-ton boat 50 metres sideways. Imagine how a little person can hold on out there with nothing to hold on to. And so I looked at that and I thought to myself, I've got a 50-50 shot. If I climb out there, I've got a 50-50 shot. But if I don't go out there, I've got zero shot. I've got no options. I'm going down with the ship.
And you got one option, and that's you need to get out there.
Yeah, and it's also that idea of putting yourself into a greater position of risk to save yourself. Like it was this wild, like emotional kind of roller coaster, because it was the logical thought of like, yep, that's the decision I've made. That's the next step. That's the logical choice to do that. And I will save myself by doing that, or at least have the best chance of doing that. And I went inside and I called Jeff, my shore manager, back up, gave him a bit of an update. And he is such a like bubbly, kind of exuberant person. And so I said to him, I've disconnected the backstay and the inner forestay. And he's like, well done, Lisa. We're all behind you. And it's like, just keep at it. And then I said I had to go out on that bowsprit. And he really understood. And he was like, oh, okay, I understand. And then I had to say, if my PLB, my personal location beacon on my life jacket's activated, it's because I've been washed off the boat and I'm now in the ocean. Don't come and rescue me. And it was really going to be the only way I could communicate to my family that I wasn't coming home. Like part of our protocols we had set up was not to have any communication with family in an emergency situation because it's too emotional. Like you're not going to be able to react the same way when you're talking to family than if you're having a logical conversation with your manager or, whatever. But yeah, I hung up that call and I crawled out into that storm and I got like 2 meters from the bow and I locked up. Like when we talk about fear, like I was literally frozen in fear. We had conversations before I left the trip with family talking about, maybe I wouldn't survive and that was okay because I was living my life. I'm achieving amazing things. I'm having an adventure. That's okay. I could die in that car accident tomorrow. But it's a very, very different thing talking about it and having this mystery theory of one day to then being like, well, in the next 5 minutes, I might not be alive anymore. And I had been exposed in the freezing conditions for over 3 hours by now. So I was quite hypothermic and I would need to look at my hand to know it had closed over the tools that I was trying to hold. Like I had no feeling in any of that. I'd been shivering uncontrollably. Like it was really that end stage. And I knew if I didn't move soon, I wasn't going to get the opportunity to move because I was going into brain fog. I was getting dead zones in my time. Like I just would zone out and then come back and be like, oh, hang on, I'm in the middle of this. Like it wasn't a good situation. I still kind of try and explain how I changed my mind, like how I talked myself out of that. But ultimately it was shouting at myself. It was calling myself names. It was checking that I've done everything possible, that this was the only choice. And then ultimately it was that idea of like, just do it because there is no other choice. Like you've just got to do it. This was the final shot, and I climbed over that rail and I sat down and like you can't see anything. It's midnight by now. Like it's pitch black, raging storm around me. That new storm started to fill in. So the waves are getting worse. The conditions are worse. And there's so much sea spray that you can't see far with the head torch. Like it's just picking up the spray. And so I sat down, and in my left hand, I had my screwdriver, and I could hold the broken bit of rail that was still there. And in my right hand, I held my hammer, but it was too fat to hold the rail as well. And I initially thought that I could use my ankles to hold on, like tie them underneath, but I was too short. And so it's just the strength of my legs that I could grip with. And like, you can't see the waves, but you can hear them. And so you can hear the wave break, and it'll be like an 8-meter wave. So you'll feel the boat kind of lift as it goes up, and then it's going up and up and up. And then you hear this crash of a wave break, and then it impacts the boat, and it'll throw you to the trough. So you got like this G-force effect of this Mack truck impact where the whole boat's tossed. And then you're trying to hold on to a stick in the front of the boat at the moment. And I hook an elbow, and I'm like kind of tossed to the side, but I stay on. And then the wave hits, and you're engulfed in whitewater, fully submerged. And 1 square meter of whitewater is 1 ton of pressure getting applied. So if you think of a 3-meter wall of whitewater impacting the boat and the violence behind that. And then I would have to let go, put the screwdriver in the fitting, like let go of the boat completely and get the hammer. And I'd get 2 or 3 strikes in before I could feel the boat going up the next wave, and we'd get the next impact. But yeah, ultimately I was able to disconnect that piece of rigging and the remaining pieces of rigging, and it took me like 4 hours in total. And I was quite hypothermic, quite emotional, and quite grateful to be able to call my shore manager up and tell him that I'd survived. Like I was in a broken boat 1,000 miles from land, but I was living, like I was still breathing at that point. And you know, that was the best outcome I could ask for.
What did you feel like? What was that relief like, you know, knowing that you, one, that you're alive, 2, that actually you're not only alive, but you've now got a chance of surviving this, of seeing this through until you're rescued? Yeah,
it's a hard one, because I got back into the boat and I tried to call Mum and I couldn't get her. And the next person I got was my PR person, Tracy. And she answered, and I couldn't speak. And I was this hysterical, sobbing mess. And she
the emotional
said,
dump and the emotional
just a
purge.
Massive, like, blurt. And
relief, I think.
Yeah. And it was like the idea that I'm so grateful that I'm alive, but it was also the sort of reality that I'd just lost everything. Like I'd worked for this for 4 years by this point, and it was gone in a blink of an eye. I mean, I'd survived, but like the record, everything it stood for, gone. And as a first project, as a girl doing a first project in the sailing world, in this kind of world, like you don't get second chances. Like this was the shot, this was the stab, and I'd lost it all. And I was still, you know, broken. Like I don't know how. I guess I didn't understand how much of an effect that trauma had on me until much, much later when I restarted the record. And it was then that I really learnt the realities of like, hang on, this was a traumatic experience. This was, you know, something that I do need time to process. But suddenly I'm in the middle of the ocean again, going through the Southern Ocean, and I don't have time for it.
So let's go back to that quick. So you end up getting rescued.
So I ended up doing a fuel transfer with a container ship, and I built a jury rig with the boom. So I built a new mast. I'd been able to salvage a small section of rigging and motor sail to Cape Town. So it took me 10 days to get to land from the time of the emergency. And then I rebuilt the boat in Cape Town, and 2 months later, in the dead of winter, I set off and went back to the Southern Ocean. And
wow, so you use this trauma as... You use
fuel.
This trauma because you can lose, as fuel, as life experience, right?
Yeah.
You've thought to yourself, right, what could possibly go wrong apart from me not coming back at all? I've been through everything. I'm going to use this experience. I'm going to really, you know, take the positives from this trauma. And
honestly, though, that didn't happen for years. No, at that point, I was still in survival mode. I was so focused on the fact I've got to do this record. I've got to, you know, I need to reach that goal or I'm going to lose everything. And so I sailed back. I really struggled mentally with that bit. I just, like every crack of a wave, I would jump a little bit more. I was a lot more tense. Before, I would be so cool and calm in these big storms, sailing through stuff that most sailors would have nightmares over, and I was like totally happy with it. And like now I had this different relationship with the sea. And I sailed the last 6 weeks back to Australia, and I eventually set the women's record with one stop. But I felt like I had failed. Like, yeah, I mean, I say it and I feel so selfish saying it this way, but like the world celebrated it as a success. And I looked at it as a failure. I looked at it as something that I went out to go and become the fastest person, not the first woman, the fastest person. And I'd failed in that goal. And it wasn't until COVID actually gave me the break, because I came back to those $300,000 in debt and the bills and everything accumulated, and I just had to work immediately. I was on the speaking tours, I was trying to fundraise, I was doing anything I could to not be forced to sell the boat. And then in COVID, I wrote the book, Facing Fear, and it gave me that little bit of breathing space. And it was the first time I'd reflected on that trip and on the dismasting. And
it's almost like a therapeutic way
so therapeutic.
I'm the same. When I write my books, it's so therapeutic. Even though you're revisiting these difficult situations, you're almost processing it and breaking it down whilst you're writing, right? And it's starting to make sense, and you're starting to gain the positives from it.
Exactly. And I realized that, like, the only reason I survived was because I had the right preparation, that planning, that mindset, the attitude. That's what allowed me to live through that scenario. And it's made me a better sailor. Like, it's made me a stronger sailor, because now I know I can trust that planning and preparation. And so that's what really. That's
what they say. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor.
Exactly.
Right?
and ultimately, that's what gave me the confidence to do it again.
This time, the story was more of a successful one.
Yes.
Just talk me through the moment that you got back on the boat and you reattacked the situation which you done, and how did you use the experience that you'd been through previously to make sure that this didn't happen on your reattack, shall we say?
Yeah, I guess like I said, the experience previously gave me a lot of trust in my decision making in the planning process, and it allowed me to know that I might not dismast on this trip, but I'm probably going to face something. And ultimately, like, we had 2 weeks of snowstorms and blizzards, and the boat was flipped upside down 3 times in 15-meter seas. Like, it wasn't an easy challenge whatsoever. And overall, the sea state was more dangerous on the second record than the first attempt. But I knew
different challenges, right?
Yeah, different challenges. And I also knew that, like, I would be able to rise to meet those challenges. And I had visualized so hard before I left on the first trip that it was going to be this incredibly difficult thing. And it was obviously incredibly difficult. But on the day-by-day living and existing on the boat in the middle of the ocean, like, there were so many beautiful moments as well. And so it allowed me on the second trip to have a second go at those moments and just make sure I took it in and experienced it in its entirety. And ultimately I was able to shave 10 days off the record, which is pretty amazing. But that became second to experiencing it and knowing for myself that I was capable and that I could do it and that I could rise to that challenge and every other challenge to come. And now I tell people, I'm like, the only thing we limit ourselves with is our mindset. Like, it's our attitude, and what we say to ourselves is self-limiting behavior. It's that idea of like, oh, I'd do that one day, or I'd love to do that, but I couldn't. Oh, I could never do that. Like, I was that person once. I used to say that all the time. I'd love to have this amazing adventure, but I couldn't sail a boat solo. No way. And here we are. Like, I've been sailing 12 years now, and I've got 8 world records. Like, it's just...
Yeah, go on, quickly talk me through those world records, because, this journey has been absolutely phenomenal. And, the mindset that you have and that you've adapted and that you've gained over the years, especially through that first attempt around the Antarctic, you have accumulated some world records, Lisa. Come on, share them with us.
So I officially set the first woman with one stop in 2017. 2018 was solo non-stop and unassisted around Australia, where I got the fastest person first monohull. First woman. And then I did Antarctica the second time. So I broke my original record of the first one with one stop and did that first one with no stops, and also broke Fedor Konyakov's record by 10 days. And then just literally like 2 months ago, I set a couple of records in New Zealand. So Sydney to Auckland speed record, where I was the fastest person, first woman. And then I set an original record, which hadn't been done before. And that was the first circumnavigation of New Zealand, solo, nonstop and unassisted. And, it seems a little bit like I'm just collecting these battle scars in these records and it's this fun thing to do. And it is an incredible journey. And the adventure is a big part of why I do it. But it's become so much more than that for me. I've got this campaign, Climate Action Now, and the records are now this platform that I can use for advocacy and change and education, and I can share my journey. And I do these post-it note campaigns. So you can go to the website, go to Get Involved and fill in a post-it note on an environmental action that you're already doing. And if you see the boat, she's wrapped in thousands and thousands of post-it notes and each one's collected from someone in the public. And so it's their message, their environmental action. And the idea is that when I started seeing the plastic pollution in the ocean and the debris, and I did microplastic sampling around Antarctica on the second record, and we found plastic in every sample the whole way around Antarctica, by the way. It's that idea of showing people that every action matters, and even the small stuff that we can do on a day-by-day basis as an individual, it matters. And we as an individual have that power to create change. It just starts with taking one action. And I'm building on that now, and I've set myself another enormous goal, which is probably more challenging or on par with like Antarctica as far as scale. It's to sail solo, nonstop and unassisted around the Arctic Circle. It's something that's only possible because of climate change, and it's not ever been done by a single human before, ever. We've got 12 people have landed on the moon. I mean, come on. Someone's got to do it, right?
Anyone can do it. You can do it, Lisa, with your mindset. But, just to finish up on, it's great to have all these records, but how important is it to shatter your personal records, as in, your limitations, your boundaries, knowing what you're capable of, that inner sort of satisfaction of knowing that you can, you're capable of these things and you're always learning, you're always growing and you're always becoming a better version of who you are. How satisfying is that? Because you're doing that,
every day.
Scrap the world records, you're doing that every day, and you're seeking that more and more. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's one of those things, like if you set yourself a goal, whatever that goal is, whether that's a life goal, work goal, whatever, you might not be able to achieve it today. But if you start taking daily steps, little actions, and start working towards it, you will grow into the person that's capable of doing that. And I think the biggest gift I've given myself is removing that limitation, that idea that I can't. And I know if I want to do anything in my life, in my career, like I can absolutely do it. It won't matter if I'm 80 and a little nana. If I want to go and set the oldest person to sail around the world record, I'll do it. Like, it's an attitude that you can live by. And I think life is an attitude, and we can't control what happens to us. We can't control what other people do to us, but we can control how we react to it, and we can control what we do with that information moving forward. And if you can do it to support yourself and to allow yourself the room to grow, then, the world's your oyster. You've got so much potential and you've just got to start tapping into it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I say to people. You just got to commit.
Yeah.
Forget about the destination. Forget about the it's the commitment after commitment after commitment. And with each commitment, there'd be a new lesson. There'd be room for growth, and there'd be room to realize what you're capable of and to become a better version of who you are.
Exactly.
And Lisa, you are the epitome of that. And that's why I love speaking to you. That's why I really took to you on $1 Million Island, because I could see that within yourself. Lisa, best of luck in the future. It's been phenomenal talking to you. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. And next time you want to go for a sail, hit me up.
Lisa Blair is the author of Facing Fear. To find out more about her book and Climate Action Now, head to lisablairsailstheworld.com. I'll also link the details in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me on Headgame. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories, and leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Middleton. Catch you again next time.